pretty important because my father, my grandfather, my entire family was in the military. I'm actually named after my great uncle who died in France. So was my father. So it's a lot of heritage there.
Just knowing that you're representing your own country, if the time comes, you can help others that need to be helped.
The friends, the comradeship, I felt like I lost a part of me when I left it.
And the CO was asking the OC, hey, what unit are those guys from? And the OC replied, oh, those guys are the Queen's Rangers. Our OC said, yes, they're quite good. And I just happened to overhear that as I was passing by, and I was like, all right, we've done something well here.
We're called the Queen's York Rangers, the first American regiment. I always wondered why we're the first American regiment where we originated in America.
First Americans refers to the fact that of the Loyalist regiments raised from amongst the American populace during the Revolutionary War, the Queen's Rangers were the first American regiment in the British Army raised entirely from the British colonies.
During the 1750s, Robert Rogers organized a civilian regiment known as Rogers Rangers to fight in the 7 Years' War. 20 years later, at the outbreak of war with the American colonies, Rogers once again raised his Ranger unit, which was renamed the Queen's Rangers after Queen Charlotte, the wife of King George III. The Rangers were a militia comprised of loyalist soldiers who were called to action to fight against the American revolutionaries. Dressed in green jackets, white breeches, and tall black hats with the crescent moon emblem, they were renowned throughout the war for their audacity and prowess. Throughout the campaign, British and American casualties were great. Even the commanding officer, John Graves Simcoe, was severely wounded 3 times. The American Revolutionary War continued through towns and the countryside and ended on September 3, 1783. With the Treaty of Paris that saw Great Britain recognize a sovereign United States to end the war. The American battle cry of liberty or death ultimately came to fruition.
The Ranger's crest is actually quite an ancient badge. So on our Revolutionary War era colors that hang in the officer's mess, it's the same badge that's there. So it's the shielded defense with Queen's Rangers, First Americans. The wreath around it is a very early form of multiculturalism, if you will. Roses, shamrocks, and thistles for English, Irish, and Scots. Most British Army regiments at the time were actually segregated by those ethnicities. When the regiment decided what its colors would be in the 1700s, they didn't have Pantone numbers, and so we don't really know exactly what colors they were talking about. And so we have examples of uniforms from that time that have faded. The regiment was, and these colors were revived in the 1930s, and I think that they probably had a different color sense at the time than maybe we do today, and perhaps selected some colors that look good in sort of an Art Deco sense, but maybe don't reflect the original colors either. So we know that they're amethyst blue and forest green, but exactly what shades those colors are is a matter of some debate.
After the American Revolutionary War, there was considerable tensions with the newly formed United States. In response to the unstable relations, John Graves Simcoe passed the 1793 Militia Act, which raised civilian militia units across Upper Canada. 3 battalions were formed in the region surrounding York, the 1st York Battalion drawing specifically from northern Yonge Street communities. Initially, these soldiers wore civilian clothes with a clearly visible white armband. In 1812, when war with the United States seemed imminent, the militia battalions were called to action under Sir Isaac Brock. The following year, the battalions were united as the Incorporated Militia of Upper Canada, and all soldiers were issued a red serge uniform. They fought at the battles of Detroit, August 15th to 16th, 1812. Queenston Heights, October 13th, 1812. And Lundy's Lane, July 25th, 1814. battle honors from those 3 events were awarded to the present-day Queen's York Rangers. The British forces were ultimately successful in stopping the American advances, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed on December 24, 1814. The incorporated militia of Upper Canada was disbanded the following year, and soldiers returned to their civilian life.
So the Queen's York Rangers are actually an amalgamation of 2 regiments, the Queen's Rangers and the York Rangers. And they were both rooted in their respective communities, the Queen's Rangers in downtown Toronto and the York Rangers in the Aurora area, in York region. And so even today, you know, because we draw from these communities and these soldiers serve in these communities, I think that the connections are quite tight. And so when there is some kind of natural disaster or other issue that requires the government to send troops to assist, then it's often soldiers from helping their own community and helping their own fellow citizens. Rangers are to a person citizen soldiers. They're rooted in those communities as well as serving the country as a soldier. The Queen's Rangers in York, when they were founded by John Graves Simcoe, the idea was that they would spend 2 days a week doing military duty, 2 days a week doing construction for civic buildings, and then 2 days a week doing labor for themselves or for others, and then a day of rest. And John Graves Simcoe, when he came up with this idea, himself was referencing his understanding of the Roman army and how Roman soldiers who were sent to expand the empire were then settled there as farmers. And so they were both citizens and soldiers.
The Militia Act of 1855 called for the establishment of permanent volunteer militias. In response, the Aurora Infantry Company was raised in 1862 and were called to action during the Fenian raids. The Fenians were Irish revolutionaries from the United States who were intent on disrupting British colonies. The Fenian and British soldiers clashed in Ridgeway, and the Aurora Infantry Company was instrumental in defending the pass at Clifton and the Niagara Suspension Bridge. The Fenians eventually retreated and were captured in the United States. In 1866, the local Aurora and surrounding area militias were amalgamated and became 12th York Battalion of Infantry. The battalion would later receive the title York Rangers, while under the command of William D. Jarvis, in honor of the previous Queen's Ranger regiments who were commanded by several of his ancestors. In 1873, it was decided that the official headquarters for the York Rangers would be in Aurora. The following year, an armory was built in Aurora's town park. It served as the home for the regiment through to 2014, when they were relocated to another facility in Aurora. In 2018 through to 2019, the armory underwent extensive restoration work and has since been repurposed. As the headquarters of the regiment, the armory was the meeting place for preparations, training, and organizing. During the 1885 Northwest Rebellion, also known as the Northwest Resistance, this is where the troops gathered and began their journey to Saskatchewan.
Letter to Leela Fleury, Aurora, from Humboldt, Tuesday evening, May 19, 1885. My dear sister Leela, we left Fort Qu'Appelle last Wednesday morning and marched every step of the way here, where we arrived tonight. The distance is 142 miles by telegraph, but over 160 by trail, as the trail winds round the sloughs, sometimes going miles from the wires. The heat has been intense and the dust fearful. My feet have been very sore, but are some better now. We march an average of about 23 miles per day. For 75 miles, we never saw a house of any kind. The stations, or stopping places for transport teams, are just tents. We live on hardtack, canned beef, pork, and tea. Please write soon. With every best love for Leela, dear, Bert, children, mama and all, believe me ever yours most affectionately, Will. So Will Fleury was the youngest son of Joseph Fleury, the founder of the Aurora Agricultural Works, and he was born in 1865. Then in 1884, he enlisted as a lieutenant in the 12th Battalion of Infantry. Then in 1885, he served as a 20-year-old in the Northwest campaign and resigned his commission later that year when he then went to law school. This is a piece of hardtack that Will signed after the campaign in 1885. It says 12th Battalion and left Aurora, and then it has signatures of several people on it. This is part of the archives of the York Rangers. Hardtack is part of the diet that was provided to soldiers who were in the Northwest campaign and many years beyond that. And Will comments in his letters about what a great diet he had, to his sister-in-law.
At the outbreak of World War I, the Canadian military system rushed to organize its existing troop structure into battalions suitable for overseas service. The 12th York Rangers supplied men and supported recruitment efforts for the 20th, 35th, 127th, and 220th Battalions. Of the four, only the 20th and 127th Battalions remained intact. Once overseas, both earned multiple battle honors across France and Belgium, each serving a distinct role in the Empire's military machine. Both battalions are perpetuated in the modern Queen's York Rangers 1st American Regiment. As part of a frontline infantry battalion, the 20th took part in a number of best-known and bloodiest battles of the First World War: La Somme, 1916, Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele in 1917. The 20th Battalion's capture of the Belgian city of Mons on the final day of the war, November 11, 1918, held great significance, as the city had been the site of the first battle and lost between the British and the Germans 4 years earlier. Once in England, the 127th Battalion was redesignated the 2nd Canadian Railway Troops due to their skill set and the engineering background of F.F. Clark, their commanding officer. Their critical role of railway troops was that of manufacturing and repairing the various gauges of track that were essential for the movement of troops and ammunition to the front, as well as the wounded, away from the fighting for medical treatment. The 127th are famous for setting a record of 6,500 feet of track laid in one day. They usually worked under shell fire and were constantly rebuilding what was being destroyed. After peace was declared, soldiers began returning home and were given a hero's welcome. In 1936, the York Rangers and a new incarnation of the Queen's Rangers merged to create the newly designated Queen's York Rangers 1st American Regiment. When World War II broke out in 1939, the Army selected some regiments to remain intact and others to be broken up to fill in necessary gaps. The Queen's York Rangers were designated as a reserve regiment and served a home defense role. A number of soldiers decided to enlist with other overseas regiments and went on to serve in active combat roles with the Royal Canadian Air Force, Signal Corps, Irish Regiment, or the 48th Highlanders, among others. As part of the home defense, the Queen's York Rangers guarded the Welland Canal against attack or sabotage by the enemy. While much action was seen by members of the Queen's York Rangers, it was seen while serving for other units, and thus no battle honors were earned for the regiment. Following the end of the war, the reserve designation was removed. The regiment was assigned the 25th Armored Regiment and began training as Sherman tank operators. It was during this time that the Rangers were known for driving their tanks through the streets of Aurora and were granted permission by landowners to use fields for maneuvers and exercises. The regiment's role as tank operators ceased in 1965, and they were assigned the duties of armored reconnaissance, recce, long-range information gathering, the role which they still hold today. In the late 20th century, the Queen's York Rangers joined Canadian forces in Cyprus, Namibia, Somalia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Kosovo.
So the Queen's York Rangers is an armored reconnaissance regiment, and the role of reconnaissance is to gather accurate tactical information on the enemy in the ground through all phases of war and pass that information back to a higher authority as quickly as possible.
Basically, an armored reconnaissance soldier, we're the eyes and the ears for the battalion. We're armored, so we're mounted. So what we would do is we would go out to a point, we would stop, we would dismount, and we would basically observe the enemy. We would set up certain positions, or we would do a dismounted patrol where we would try to observe the enemy and relay to the brigade battalion what's going on.
And then in 1998, I got the opportunity to go overseas with the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment, and that was to Bosnia, and that was with the Stabilization Force, which came in after the Dayton Accords were signed in 1995. And then I got to go overseas again in 2003, back to Bosnia, but I also got to bring 9 other Rangers with me, and I was their commander as a sergeant, so I was a section commander. And in 2010, I went to Afghanistan as a warrant officer, as a company sergeant major mentor with the operational mentor and liaison team, so working directly with the Afghan National Army, and that was very educational.
The Queen's York Rangers provided armored recon to Canadian and Allied forces in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014, with nearly 1/3 of the reserve unit serving there.
So then I went overseas in August 2006, and I was deployed with CIMIC, which is Civilian Military Cooperations. Basically, we were there to help the civilians reestablish their communities.
But just to give you some context, when you're on operations, you work 7 days a week, often long days, some 16, 18 hours, depending on your task and depending on what's happening in theater. And you get a few breaks, but they're short, comparatively speaking.
So personally, I was a platoon commander for a force protection platoon for the National Support Element. So the National Support Element is made up of logistics soldiers primarily, mechanics, cooks, administration personnel. We were tasked as basically their bodyguards, so we'd escort them from forward operating base to forward operating base or back to Canada Airfield. We had, I think, if I'm not mistaken, we had 12 Queen's York Rangers in our platoon, which was the largest contingent. So we knew each other fairly well. And at the time, we would take a lot of video, a lot of photos of the area to give back to the intelligence so that they could use that video to try to get a better understanding of what ditches look like, riverbeds, road conditions, that kind of thing. So we have quite a large stockpile of photos and video. I grew up in Aurora. I joined the Army here because my family was all military, all Toronto Scottish in Toronto, but it was a lot closer, obviously, to go to the Armory here. So in '99, I joined the co-op program through my high school.
To this day, the Queen's York Rangers are located in Aurora and have a new armory where training occurs throughout the year.
Drive vehicles, pretty much. Drive maintenance of vehicles, just to assess any issues with the vehicles. That's pretty much it.
Right now, I'm just learning the ropes, just trying to get used to what it is to be part of the Canadian Armed Forces.
I'm not too sure yet. Like, I haven't found my place yet. I'm still working on that.
And just experiencing things that you don't normally experience.
Qualifications. I want to get better.
In 2010, I left the Rangers. I took a 5-year hiatus. I came back in 2016 because I missed it so much.
I mean, one of the toughest questions I've asked myself as I've contemplated retirement is, what does it mean to not be part of the unit anymore and not be an active member of the Queen's York Rangers? And I don't think I have an answer for that just yet.
Just now I ran into Master McCarty, who was my gunner in Afghanistan. I haven't seen him in 5 years, but it was like I saw him 2 days ago.
I think it actually puts a lot of pressure on us to keep the same standards the regiment has had for coming up on 300 years. I think that's what it means to be a Ranger, is to have all that history behind you and having a very high standard to live to.
But all any of us really want is to make sure that we uphold the honor and the pride of the regiment, and that those that went before us in the great big mess of the sky are looking down and going like, all right, job well done.